Well, by now, many of you have probably looked inside your program and you have seen the outline, seen what I'm talking about. It was 1 year ago, on Sunday, October 15th, that my son Jeff died. And tonight I want to share with you what I've been learning, my family and I together have been learning, how we have processed and are continuing to process this loss in our life. And I really debated about whether or not to do this talk. In fact, some of the folks closest to me, we had a lot of discussion about this, and I finally decided to do it for this reason. Every single one of you in this room have experienced loss. For some of you, it's been the kind of catastrophic loss that I had this past year, losing my son. Maybe for you, it was a parent, a friend, a sibling. There are other kinds of loss, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But the thought that I want to get across tonight is that everyone experiences loss, and how you deal with it, how you process it, is transformational one way or the other. You experience loss, and it can make you better, or you can process it poorly, and it can make you bitter. You experience loss, and your faith can flourish and grow in the middle of it, or you process it poorly and your faith can flounder. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about what we've learned about processing grief and loss over the last year. And does that sound okay? Well, I hope so, because it's what you're getting whether you like it or not. So, all right, let's pray. Lord, this is one of those subjects that just cuts right to the heart. And there are many people here in the room who've experienced loss just as devastating as the one that we did this past year. And there are other people here who perhaps don't look at it quite that same way, but maybe haven't had that same kind of experience, but someday will. But all of us have experienced loss, and tonight I ask, Lord, that you'd help me share some practical ideas on how to process that and come out better for it. And I pray when we're all done that every single person here, every person without exception, would be able to walk away and say, I got something good from that, something that's going to help me. Make it beneficial. That's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Let's say hi to each other. Take a minute. Welcome the folks around you. Well, if you'll take out your outline, I want to dive into this talk. And we're going to read together a statement up at the top of the outline, an introduction sentence. And while you're getting that outline out, let me tell you that at the end of the talk, we're going to take communion together. And so right at the end of the talk, you'll notice the worship team coming back out. They're going to lead us in a couple songs, and the ushers will come then and pass out the communion elements, and I'll let you know about that when that happens. All right? At the top of your outline, there's a quote there. The introduction, it says, "It doesn't matter how great the pressure is." I'm going to ask if you'd all read that out loud with me. Ready? Here we go. It doesn't matter how great the pressure is. What really matters is where the pressure lies, whether it comes between you and God, or whether it presses you nearer his heart. That's a quote from J. Hudson Taylor, a missionary to China in the 19th century. And when I was 19 years old and a sophomore in college, I read his biography entitled Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret. It's a great, great book. And this is one of many quotes that I've kept with me from that book. And this particular one, though, has always been really special to me because it just says, pressure's going to come. It doesn't matter where it comes. How great the pressure is. What matters is where you let it settle. If it gets between you and God, pushes you apart, or if it pushes you closer to his heart. On Tuesday, I told you that I debated long and hard about whether or not to do this talk. And kind of the final deciding point was Tuesday. Tuesday night, I had all my family over, all my kids and their spouses, and we met together and just talked about this, about what God's done in our lives in this past year as we've been processing Jeff's death and our own grief, working through it. And I'll mention some things about that meeting Tuesday night a little later. Also on Tuesday, the other thing I did to get ready for this was I spent several hours reading through my journal this past year. I actually went back to a week before Jeff died and just read through my journal for the whole year. Very moving experience for me, and reminded me again why journaling is such a valuable exercise. And through the course of the talk, you'll hear me reference a few of these journal selections, things that I wrote down, lessons that I learned since the death of my son a year ago. Now, before I get to the lessons, I gotta back up here a little bit and just tell you a little bit of the story. Many of you know it, but some of you don't, and so bear with me. I'll make this short. But Lane and I have 5 children. Andy, our oldest, is 25, and then Jeff, Sally, Amy, and Michael, our youngest, is 19. And Jeff, our number 2 son, was born at Deaconess Hospital on November 8th, 1983. And we brought him home 2 days later. Here's a little photo of Mom and Dad and baby Jeff and his brother Andy, 18 months older than him. And Jeff had a big head, like a really, really big head, off the charts. Big head. And so big that, in fact, 2 times in the first 18 months of his life, we took him into the hospital for a CAT scan to see if he had hydrocephalia. And both times, the doc came out after the scan and said, nope, just has a big head. He had a poor sucking reflex, and you might think that's not a big deal, but with a baby, I mean, Jeff would nurse for an hour and get an ounce or 2 of milk. And then he'd sleep for an hour, and of course he'd wake up after an hour hungry and nurse for another hour, and then sleep for an hour and nurse for an hour. He did this for 4 months. 1 hour on, 1 hour off. Lena did the nursing, by the way, not me. And we just didn't get a whole lot of sleep for those first 4 months. We were very tired. Unlike most babies, when you would tickle Jeff or talk to him, rather than looking at your face or smiling, he would always avert his eyes. He'd look away. And somewhere in that first year, around the 6 to 8 month mark, my mom, who has been a nurse her whole adult life, was staying with us for a week, and my mom said, Joe, I think he might be autistic. And I just brushed that off, dismissed it. Lesson number 1, always listen to your mom. I got an amen on that one, thank you. Well, Jeff was a handful as a preschooler. He was very active, very impulsive, very loud. He was just having a little bit of fun here, but this kid was a handful. But folks, the poop hit the fan in the school years. And he got to school and just all kinds of trouble broke loose. We had him tested and treated for ADHD unsuccessfully. We spent huge numbers of hours up at the school advocating for him with teachers and school staff. We took him to learning specialists, all different kinds of doctors, psychologists. And by the 6th grade, when Jeff was floundering in school, we decided to homeschool him. And when the other 4 kids heard that Jeff was going to be homeschooled, they all protested. They wanted to be homeschooled too. So for the next year, Lena homeschooled all 5 kids. And then Jeff for 4 years, and each of the other kids for different times, and they eventually all went back into school. Middle of his 9th grade year, Jeff returned to high school and just struggled mightily. Struggled academically, but especially struggled socially. And by the middle of his senior year, Jeff had worn out his small group of friends, and he entered what we called the dark years, a period of about 4 years of deep loneliness and alienation, anger and frustration. He graduated from high school during that time, tried going to college several times unsuccessfully, worked at a number of jobs, but was just very lonely and frustrated. When he was 21 years old, by the way, all during that time too, all during the dark years, we were attempting to try and figure out we knew something wasn't right, and we'd known it for 20 years. But trying to pinpoint it had proved to be almost impossible. And when Jeff was 21, after all these unsuccessful attempts to diagnose his disability, we finally did. We discovered that Jeff had Asperger's syndrome, a form of high-functioning autism that's characterized by a number of traits, most significantly by social disability. My mom, it turns out, was right. Asperger's kids, we found out when Jeff was diagnosed, we found out Asperger's kids are often born with large heads and poor sucking reflexes. We found out they don't like to look you in the eye, and oftentimes they don't like to be touched. Jeff never liked to be hugged. In fact, here's a little photo of Big Brother giving him a hug. And this is a pretty typical response to a hug. Don't touch me, you know. Well, this particular diagnosis at this time, I just can't tell you what a big difference this made. It was a huge help to Jeff and to us. And all of us began educating ourselves, understanding how Jeff was wired and how life looked to him. And just to give you some idea of how life looked to Jeff, imagine this. You know, most of you here in the room, most of you are Caucasian. So if I took you and dropped you, say, in Latvia, you could probably blend in. You know, you could probably look Latvian. So imagine if we did that, if I just parachuted you into Latvia and all of the Latvians looked at you and they thought that because you look Latvian, because you look like one of them, that you could speak the language and understand the culture. But of course, you don't know a stitch of Latvian, don't know anything about the culture. And so they come up and jabber at you in Latvian and you stand there feeling like what? Like an idiot. That's what social interaction was like for Jeff. Social interaction was like a foreign language. And everyone looked at him and he looked normal and they just assumed that he got it, but he didn't. And because he didn't, he consistently made blunders socially that offended people. For example, he was completely unaware of his own facial effect. You know, what his, that his mood would show on his face and that other people would look at that and, and he looked angry and didn't realize it, and people were always put off. Or the tone of his voice, no idea how he sounded and how that came across. And he was also consistently offended by others because he misunderstood their social cues and signals. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to have that kind of a disability and feel like every time you went out in public with someone that you were never sure how you should act or what they meant by the things they said or did? Very, very difficult. That's Asperger's, and that's what Jeff faced every single day. Well, after his diagnosis, Jeff started educating himself. He became more helpful, got a little twinkle in his eye, some smiles. And the dark years changed into better times that last year and a half. He was back in school, trying to make some friends, and we finally also found some meds that helped him a little bit. Well, that prompted Jeff to start searching online, seeing if he could find maybe some meds that would be even better. And eventually it led to him trying to buy some prescription meds illegally. By the way, 2 days after Jeff died, we got a package from India of prescription painkillers that Jeff had ordered online without a prescription, no doc. I didn't even know you could do that. A week later, we got a notice that the Border Patrol had intercepted a package of prescription meds coming up from Panama that Jeff had ordered online. On Saturday, October 14th, Jeff bought some OxyContin from a friend he knew at work. Jeff had absolutely no idea what he was messing with, no idea how powerful this prescription painkiller is, and thought like many people, it's a prescription medicine, can't hurt me. And by the way, I hope if any of you here have these powerful drugs in your home that you keep them locked up and only take them under a doctor's supervision. Well, that Saturday evening, Jeff took this dose of OxyContin, spread out his snacks and soda on the coffee table in front of him, put a movie in the TV, laid down to watch a movie, fell asleep, and never woke up. The next morning, Sunday morning, Zach and Amy and Sally found him down in the basement, lying there on the couch. He'd been dead for 7 or 8 hours by the time they found him. And I was sitting right down here in my usual seat during the 11 o'clock service. The prayer time was just finishing. I was getting ready to get up and speak when some friends came and took me by the elbow and said, "You can't get up. You've got to go home." "Why?" I said, "Lena needs you at home." And they walked me up the aisle and told me out in the hall that my son had died. And it was the darkest, most difficult day of my life and the hardest thing I've ever had to face. So very briefly, that's what happened. And before I tell you what I learned this past year processing my grief, I want to tell you a couple things that I learned from Jeff, from this really unusual kid. So that's number one on your outline. A couple things I learned from Jeff. The first one's this: don't give up. Don't give up. I told you Jeff tried to go to college 4 times. First time he dropped out after a week. Second time he managed to finish 1 class of the 3 he signed up for. The third time he dropped out after 2 days. And he was in college on his 4th attempt when he died. And folks, I may as well just say this as plainly as I can. I mean, this is a kid who just, wasn't given a full deck to play with. You know what I mean? He just had some deficits. He had some liabilities, some limitations that most of us here in the room don't face. And yet, he was just so determined to make it, to succeed in life. And, knock him down, get up, go try again. He enlisted in the Marines a year out of high school. I thought, Jeff, of all the different services you could go into, you picked the toughest one, with a 13-week boot course. He lasted 2 weeks. I mean, his particular disability did not mesh well with boot camp, believe me. But he got home from that, and 6 months later, he's down visiting the Army recruiter to try to sign up. Like, get knocked down, get up, try again. In March of 2006, March last year, he took a job on an Alaskan fishing boat in the Bering Sea in March. Do you have any idea how rough that is up there? Yeah. He ralphed his guts out. I mean, truly, he got so sick, he was puking so hard that as soon as they got close to land, they put him ashore and said sorry and flew him home. 3 months later, he was back at it on an Alaskan freighter, running freight from Seattle up to Alaska. And lasted a week on that job. And what happened, I got to tell you, it was just because it was so funny. One day, the boss on the boat said, hey, Jeff, why don't you jump on that boom and move those big boxes of freight? Now, you or I would have told the boss, I've never run a boom. That thought never crossed Jeff's mind. So he just climbed on the boom, and the first box he picked up was a $10,000 or $11,000 crate of whiskey, which he promptly dropped onto the deck of the ship and smashed. And they set him off at the next port and said, you're a liability. We can't have you on the ship. He got home and told me the story. I high-fived him. I said, hey, at least you dropped the right box, buddy. Good job, But I mean, he'd get knocked down and he'd get up. Try again. Here's an entry from my journal on January 13th of this year. Luke 13:30, it says, this is Jesus speaking. He said, there are those who are last who will be first, and those who are first who will be last. In the New Living Translation, it says, some who seem important now, or some who seem least important now will be the greatest then, and some who are the greatest now will be least important then. And I wrote this in my journal. I thought of Jeff, who was last in our house, least in terms of his success and achievements and status. And by the way, Jeff was always very, very aware of that all of his brothers and sisters all succeeded in school and all had tons of friends and got along well, and he was very aware of that and felt very keenly that deficit that he lived with. His deficits made him last, and somehow God will make up for those deficits and he'll be first. Of course, he's the first from our family to heaven. Eugene Peterson calls this first to last thing the great reversal. Those who went without here will have it there. While Jeff was last in many ways, I saw some remarkable things in his life. His courage. I would have never tried the Marines or Arctic fishing boats. His resilience. He'd fail, but get up and keep trying. His effort. Life was a daily struggle. It was hard every day, but he refused to give up. And I know many people who are far more gifted than Jeff and live without his deficits, who show far less courage and resilience and effort. And I admire him. Those things, I think, will be rewarded in heaven where he'll receive the honor he deserves. And then I thought about all the people like Jeff. So many people who live somewhere near the bottom of the heap. It takes so much more courage for these people to face each day than for most of us. Imagine what it would be like to be one of the least of these, as Jesus described them. I'm sure they noticed the snubs, the brush off, the disrespect. And someday Jesus said the tables will be turned and they'll be first, and God will reward them for the spectacular courage and resilience they show just getting up every day and doing it again. You know, folks, honestly, I look out across this room and I look at you, and most of you, if not all of you, are far more gifted than my son. You're smarter than him. You've got far more social grace. You'll go far. But I just want to challenge you. I don't care how gifted or smart you are. Sometimes life knocks you down. And when it does, don't stay there. Get up. Get up and do it again. It's a lesson I learned from my son. Another lesson I learned from Jeff, letter B, was to underreact. I'm a major overreactor. I know that probably shocks you. I'm kind of an emotional guy. And there were times when Jeff just pushed all my buttons. And I'm ashamed to say there were times when I would lose my cool. I did or said things that I regretted. And of course, the sad part was, my overreactions were like pouring gas on a fire. I mean, Jeff would say something, I'd get mad, Jeff would get madder, I'd overreact, he'd go through the roof. It was ugly. And there were times during those dark years where we had some ugly confrontations. And I remember telling Lena one night, I said, honey, if someone could have been here today with a videotape and played the video for the church, everyone in our church would be looking for another church with a better pastor. Because I didn't behave very well. I was talking one day with Rick at our office, and he related a story to me about Jeff. Stan Busby had taken Jeff and 3 or 4 other 9th or 10th grade guys backpacking and rock climbing. And they were scaling this, fairly sheer granite face. And Jeff was about 2/3 of the way up, and Stan was up at the top. And Jeff got 2/3 of the way up and just got, I think, worn out or something. And he looked up at Stan and says, I can't make it. And Rick said Stan just looked at him, didn't say a thing, just left him hanging there. After a minute or so, Jeff scrambled on up to the top. And Rick said to me, he said, Joe, Stan underreacted. Maybe that's what Jeff needs. I heard that and I thought, needs a different dad, I'm a major overreactor. I'm a mess. Underreact. It became my mantra with Jeff. And so when Jeff would blow up, which he did quite regularly, I learned to underreact. When he'd come into the kitchen and say unkind things to his mother and I just wanted to take his head off, I'd underreact. Now, it wasn't that I did nothing or said nothing, but I learned to give a very calm, measured response. And it worked. Rather than escalating tensions, it calmed them down. We learned that if we just underreacted, if Jeff would blow up, say something, stomp downstairs, and instead of me chasing after him, yelling at him, if I just underreacted, 15 or 20 minutes later, up he'd come, apologize. He'd scramble up the hill. But folks, this was hard for me. I'm not only a major overreactor, I come from a long line of major overreactors. This is inbred into me. But this is a lesson that served me well, not only with my son, but with other people as well. I've learned when people are upset to underreact. Proverbs 15:1 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. That's the Bible's way of saying underreact. A gentle answer turns away wrath. It's been a real life changer for me, and this is a lesson, again, I learned from my son. By the way, one other thing, Tuesday night when all the kids were over, one of the things, when I asked them, what have you learned? One of the things they all said, all 4 of them said this. They all said, I'm a better person because of Jeff. And here were some of the things they said. Some of them said, I learned to underreact too, Dad. Another one said, I learned compassion. I learned to be understanding toward people who don't have the advantages that we may have. I learned tolerance. I learned patience. And of course, Pastor Noel kind of summed it all up. Those of you who've been in his class have heard him say this, that Jeff taught us all unconditional love. And so we're really grateful. We're grateful for the almost 23 years we had with this young man in our home. Difficult as they were, God used him to teach us some things. Let me finish now by talking about some lessons about life loss and faith. Number 2 in your outline, life loss and faith. And letter A here, the first thing, this was a really easy one because I learned this right after Jeff died. My default answer to my family is yes. My default answer to my family is yes. On the night that Jeff died, he came into my room. It was about 8 o'clock, and he said, hey, Dad, can we go to a movie? And I was busy working on the weekend message. Usually I have it done Friday sometime, but it had been a really busy weekend with lots of other things going on. So here it is, Saturday night, 8 o'clock. I'm not done yet, and Sunday's coming, right? So I'm pounding away, and he says, can we go to a movie? And I said, sorry, buddy, I can't. Those were the last words I said to my son. Sorry, I can't. And I regret that. I wish I would have said yes. And so one of the things I determined to do shortly after Jeff died was to say yes. To say yes to my family every time. Hey, Dad, can you watch this movie with us? Yeah, I can. Dad, can you come out and throw the football? Yeah. Hey, Dad, could you take a look at my car? Ask your husband, honey. Nah, I'd say yes. Yes to. Yes, even if it means dropping something that I'm doing right now, something that may be important. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, come on, Joe, you can't say yes every time. I mean, sometimes you have to say no, and of course, you're right. Sometimes you do. But I want to say yes every time if it's within my power. One Friday night not long ago, this same scenario repeated itself where just over the course of Friday, as I was working on my talk, several times the kids would call me and say, Dad, could you do this? Dad, could you do this? And each time, I'm happy to say, I said yes. As a result of that, I was up very late that Friday night, actually into the wee hours Saturday morning. I finished my talk about 1:30 Saturday morning. And as I closed my computer, 1:30 in the morning, got ready to jump in bed, I just thought it was worth it. It was worth it to say yes to my kids. No one in the world more important to me than my family, so I'm going to just say yes every time I can. Here's what I wrote in my journal. This was November 22nd, just a little over a month after Jeff died. And I wrote, several weeks ago, I had a day when I pondered my regrets about Jeff. As I write this, I don't feel guilty. I'm not beating myself up, but it's worth learning from my mistakes so I can be a better dad for my other kids. Here's some of my regrets. Number one, I regret that we didn't get a diagnosis sooner. If we had known when Jeff was young what we know now, who knows how different things would have been for him and for us. Number two, I regret all the times I lost my temper with Jeff. When he was little, it must have been terrifying and confusing to have a father who was that angry. When he was older, it was still confusing and usually just exacerbated whatever ill feelings Jeff was having. Number three, I regret that I didn't tell him every day that I loved him. I regret that I didn't try to hug him more even though he didn't like it. Number four, I regret that I didn't take him shooting more. Jeff liked guns. He always liked guns. And I had some heartburn with that. You take a teenage kid with high impulsivity, a hair trigger temper, and mix that with guns. I mean, honestly, folks, one of the most frightening nights of my life was in November after he had graduated from high school, in the middle of those dark years when he was so angry and so frustrated. And he walked into the house on a Wednesday night about 8 o'clock and said, Dad, check this out. And he showed me the AR-15 assault rifle he just bought. I'm happy to say I underreacted. Truly. I mean, my initial response was, you can't keep this. You got to take it back. But I very quickly thought on my feet and thought, wait a minute. I mean, obviously he's old enough to buy it. He did. He bought it. And if I tell him to take it back, he's not going to take it back. He's just going to stash it in the trunk of his car. I won't know where it is or what he's doing with it. So we worked out a little treaty about the gun. But I said, I regret that I didn't take him shooting more. It was something that he liked that we could have done together. I was just uncomfortable with him and guns. I should have gotten past my discomfort and sought the common ground with my son. I regret that I didn't take him to a movie that last Saturday night. I regret that I didn't invite him to lunch that last Saturday. I felt badly when he called us and asked us where we were, and I told him his still haunts me. I know there's some of you thinking, good night, Joe. Why in the world would you sit down and write a list of regrets? Because this is part of the grieving process. To honestly face your loss and look back and say, what I wish I could have done different, and learn from it. And one of the things I learned, I hope you're hearing very clearly, is I learned to say yes to my family every time. And by the way, my oldest son heard that at the 11 o'clock service and came up and said, could I have $20, Dad? So I said yes and reached for my wallet and realized I'd left it at home. Hallelujah. So, all right, B. Letter B. Loss is normal. Embrace it and grow from it. Loss is normal. Maybe normal is not the very best word, but what I'm trying to say is that loss is a normal part of life. I mean, everyone experiences it. Everyone. Everyone experiences loss, and the truth is, lots of it. And there are different kinds of loss. For example, there's catastrophic loss, like the Cougars suffered at the hands of the Ducks yesterday. 53-7. Listen, it gets worse. I was there. My brother-in-law had tickets on the 48-yard line at Autzen Stadium. I showed up wearing my crimson and gray and sat all by myself in a sea of yellow and green all around me. And I'm happy to tell you that the Duck fans that were around me were great. They had a lot of fun at my expense. I mean, I could tell you stories, but they razzed me the whole game. But I do have to tell you that in the third quarter, when the Cougars scored their one and only touchdown, I did jump up and turn around and do a little grinding dance for them and give them the touchdown sign, which they actually gave me a little applause and said, it's your moment, enjoy it, that's it. Well, there are catastrophic losses, like the death of a child or a spouse or a family member, a disability like the one Jeff had, an irreversible loss of health like terminal cancer, divorce, rape, abuse, infertility, betrayal by a friend, losing your dream job, bankruptcy, the death of a lifelong dream. I mean, those are things that just about everybody faces at one time or another, catastrophic loss. And then, folks, there's a whole nother category of loss that's just what I call natural loss. How about this one? You get older and you start losing things. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, you lose your waistline, you lose your hair, you lose your hearing, lose your eyesight, lose your mind. I mean, it all starts going. Natural loss. Friends move away. It's just part of life, natural loss. Your children grow up and move out. That's been a big one for us this past year. You know, a year ago, before Jeff died, there were 8 of us still at our house. Lena and Noel and I were upstairs, and our 4 youngest kids and our niece were filling up the downstairs bedrooms. And today, there's 3 of us. Noel and Lane and I, the old farts, puttering around upstairs. I mean, I can't believe I just said that in church, but anyway, you know what I'm talking about. The kids grow up and move out, and listen, no matter how much everybody, they move out, and parents all go, whoa, yeah, but still inside, it's a loss. You know what I'm talking about? It's a loss. You miss them. You move, lose your neighbors, you change churches, your life group disbands after a few years, your dog dies. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Natural loss. Why am I saying this? Because everybody in this room has, is, or will experience loss. And yet, when we do, we always act so surprised. How could this happen to me? What was God thinking? I mean, this just isn't right. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. This is not the way I planned my life. You know what I'm saying? We act surprised. And then, not knowing how to process the loss, oftentimes we grieve inappropriately. We may become angry or permanently bitter. Or I know a lot of people who their approach is, well, just get over it, right? In fact, people tell you that. Just get over it, which, by the way, almost certainly guarantees that you won't. Loss is normal. You've got to embrace it and grow from it. You've got to pay attention to your loss. You can't be in a hurry to get over it, and you can't view it as an interruption. This is a really interesting thing. Don't view it as an interruption. You know, we all have our planned lives, right? This is how we picture our lives going. And then something catastrophic happens, and we go, that's not in the plan. That's an interruption to my plan. Tuesday night when the family was meeting and talking about this, one of the concerns that was raised in the family meeting was, Dad, aren't you concerned that this kind of interrupts the plan for your talks? You know, because last week you gave the vision talk, and the next two series are kind of all about some vision things. You know, it's like you're trying to build a little momentum and get everybody, you know, aligned and moving the same direction. And then in the middle of all that, you drop this talk. I mean, don't you think it's kind of an interruption? After the kids left and Lane and I were alone, she said, Joe, I've been thinking about that. She said, that's the way life is. Life interrupts your plans. Have you all experienced that? Life interrupts your plans. And she reminded me that on the day Jeff died, we were starting to raise money here at Life Center to do this parking lot deal. And that whole thing, you know, I got through one service and that was it. The whole thing got put on hold for 9 months because life interrupted our plans. So don't resent loss as an unwelcome interruption into your perfectly controlled and planned life. Instead, embrace it, grieve appropriately and fully. Your losses are not something to just get over. They're something of great value to you and to God. And when you're unable to mourn appropriately, it simply misshapes your relational capacities. You know what most of us want to do with pain? We want to what? We want to avoid it is what we want to do. We avoid it, we medicate it, we numb it, we ignore it, we hope it'll go away, rather than accepting it, feeling it, and grieving it. And we use all kinds of things to medicate our pain. We use work, we use TV, we use drugs and alcohol. We'll go on shopping or food binges. We'll use busyness, we'll use sex, we use unhealthy relational attachments. Sometimes we even use serving others at church as a way to medicate the pain in our life. And when we do that, folks, when we fail to really feel what we're feeling, our inability to face and feel pain just makes us superficial and unable to really express compassion to others in their pain. But when we take the time to grieve our losses before moving on, we grow deeper as a result of that. My good friend Jerry Sitzer, his wonderful book, A Grace Disguised, which is all about growing through loss, was a tremendous help to me. And then Jerry, besides his book, is just my friend. And we talked a lot this last year. And Jerry helped me understand that, in fact, here's a great thought, folks. He says, Joe, you don't get over catastrophic loss, you grow into it. You don't get over catastrophic loss, you grow into it. It's like it forever alters the landscape of your life, and you just have to let it grow up and get comfortable in the new landscape. It becomes part of who you are as a person. You know, some people have asked me, are you over Jeff's death? The answer is, I'll never be over Jeff. I miss him every day. You know, when I see Jeff's picture, it still stops me dead in my tracks every time. When you lose someone, you know, the thing is, well, let's try to get life back to normal as soon as we can. But as soon as you do, you realize it's not the same. It's a new kind of normal. You know what I'm saying? It's a new normal. You know, normal in our house now, normal in our house is sitting down for dinner and his chair's empty. That's a new normal. Normal is going downstairs and his room is clean for the first time ever. It's a new normal. It's weird. Normal now, normal's missing the weird, funny things he used to do. You know, he used to stomp up the stairs every day, complain that there was nothing to eat, even though the cupboards in the fridge were full. He used to walk in upstairs, Lane and I'd be upstairs, and he'd walk in and get out Newsweek or the newspaper, and he would stand there and read bits and pieces of articles out loud. and have this running commentary that sounded like a crazy talk radio show host, and, complain over and over again that the whole country was going to hell in a handbasket. It's funny what you miss, isn't it? And folks, I want to tell you something. There were a lot of days when he would do his weird stuff, and then stomp back downstairs, and I'd tell Lena, oh man, I can hardly wait till he moves out. And I'd give anything to get him back. It's a new kind of normal. And normal means you live with the loss. You grow into the loss and embrace it, and it gives you a chance to grieve and to grow. So embrace the loss, and you've got to give yourself some time to grieve. This is one of the things that maybe surprised me the most, was how draining grief was and how long it took me. I am, by nature, a very resilient and optimistic person. I mean, some of you know that about me. I have tons of energy. But after Jeff died, I lost my energy. I was tired. I couldn't seem to get enough sleep. I'd sleep 9, sometimes 10 hours a night and still wake up tired. But worse than the sleeping energy was just that I had no energy, no motivation to do the thing that I love to. I love being the pastor of this church. I love what I do, and I had no motivation for it. I mean, folks, I'd come and sit down here, and during worship, I'd stand here during worship and I love God, but I could hardly bring myself to sing the songs. I'd get up and force myself through a sermon, and then afterwards stand down here and try to smile and be interested in what people were saying to me. The whole time I'm going through this, the worship, the teaching, the talking, the whole time I'm thinking, I just wish I could be home by myself. And it wasn't because I didn't love God or didn't love you. It was just I had no energy to interact with people. I showed up this was in November, just about a month after Jeff died, and I showed up here at the office on a Monday, which is my day off. Really stupid. I have no idea why I came down. But here I was, and because I was in the office, someone said, hey, Joe, we got to ask you a question. What should we do about the Christmas Carol sing, which is coming up in a month? We got to get that ready. What do you want us to do? And inside, my thought was, I don't want to do the Christmas Carol sing. I don't even want to do Christmas Eve services. In fact, I don't even want to do church this next Sunday. Get me out of here. I just can't do it. And that feeling of being drained and empty and having no energy lasted 6 months. 6 months. In fact, I remember the day right at the 6-month mark where I came home one day after work with a smile on my face. I told Lena, hey, Lena, I actually enjoyed my appointments today instead of just enduring them. I enjoyed being with people. I had energy for them. 6 months. And there were days in that 6 months when I wondered if it would ever come back. It did, but it took a while. And what I learned was I just had to embrace the grief. Not try to get over it, just embrace it. Grieve your way through the loss. Grow into it, and then the healing begins. Letter C, I'm almost done. Letter C is the counterpoint to the point I just gave you. It's okay to be sad, but don't become a sad person. This is the counterpoint, the other side of the coin, if you will. In March of this year, Lane and I were at a pastor's conference. I happened to be leading this conference. There were about 35 couples there. And this is still in the middle of that, or toward the end of that 6-month period where I didn't have any energy. And so here's the deal. I'm leading this pastor's thing, but I didn't want to be there. Again, not because I didn't love the people. I just didn't have the energy to be there. But there I was. And Tuesday morning, we did the morning session. And at the end of the session, everyone heads out to lunch. And everybody always, the couples always kind of pair up 2s and 3s and 4 couples at a time, and off they go, off to lunch. And we're always with 2 or 3 or 4 other couples, going off to these deals. But the way this worked out was really a weird deal. It was like, we stood there talking, we were the last ones to leave, and when we got ready to leave, we picked up our Bibles to go, Elaine and I did, and we looked around, the room was empty, it was just us. There was nobody. I looked at Lena and I said, God has given us a great gift. And I wasn't kidding. I didn't have the energy to be with anybody. And I thought, this is really cool. They've all left us here alone. And so we found a little corner in a restaurant, just the 2 of us. And we talked about this whole deal, the energy and all that. And then Lena said something that just rocked me. Here's what she said. She said, Joe, you know so-and-so, and she mentioned a friend, someone that we love very deeply, who lost a child many years ago. And she said, you know how over the years we've talked many times that when he lost his child, the light went out of his eyes, the wind went out of his sails, the joy left his life. This was a guy who was very exuberant, enthusiastic. I mean, just, you know, he was the life of the party. And after his child died, gone. And Lane and I, she was right. We had talked about that many times over the years and prayed for him. And then here's what she said to me. She said, Joe, I don't want that to happen to you. I don't want you to become a sad person. And that was like a knife that went into my heart. And I promised her there, sitting at that table, just the two of us, that with God's help, I was going to grieve and grieve fully, but I was not going to get stuck in my grief. I could be sad without becoming a sad person. Now, I know some of you are thinking, how does this work with the thing you just said? You know, the idea here, folks, is that you grieve well, and if you grieve well, you can heal and be joyful again. If you grieve well, you don't really get over it, but again, you grow into it, into this new landscape, this new normal. And it takes some people longer than others. But take whatever time you need and do the grieving you need to do so that you can get that bounce back in your step and the joy, the wind back in your sails. It's okay to be sad, but not to become a sad person. And the last thing, letter D, I am a Christian. I believe in God. I am a Christian. I believe in God. And by the way, I picked that phrase deliberately because 2 weeks ago when we did the martyr deal, remember that? That was so moving to me to hear these martyrs down through the centuries give this answer. I am a Christian. And many people have asked me in the last year, what did Jeff's death do to your faith? How did it affect your relationship with God? And I know the answer to that because the answer happened in the very first week after Jeff's death. In fact, 5 days after Jeff died, our family, just our immediate family, gathered at the cemetery right over here to bury Jeff. And the defining moment for me, a moment of stunning clarity, came when I took the little box that had his ashes, all that remained of his physical body. And I took that box and I set it into the hole and I took the shovel and began to put the dirt in and tamp it down. And in that moment, holding that box, I understood something with striking clarity. Here's what it is. Right now, in this moment, holding this box, I've got two options. Two options. I can believe, like many people do, that this life is all there is, that there is no God. And if I believe that, then my son is dead and gone forever. And all that remains of him is a box of ashes that I'm putting in the ground. Or I can believe option two, that there is a God and that my son is more alive now than he's ever been. And in that moment, just with, again, like I said, stunning clarity, I saw the options that lay before me, and I said, I am a Christian. I believe in God. And with all my heart, I believe that my son is, in fact, more alive right now than he's ever been. You might wonder, how can you be sure of that? You know, you sound like you're so sure. And the Bible says in Hebrews 11:1, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we don't see. I believe, and so I'm sure. You say, well, that's just faith. But those two options I gave you, folks, are both based on faith. Someone who says God is not there can't prove that any more than you can prove that he is. And in the end, what it comes down to is you standing there and facing these two options and saying, which do I believe? I am a Christian. I believe in God. I was with Jerry last week, Jerry Sitzer, and he said something to me that was so striking. You know, Jerry, about 15 years ago, was in a tragic car accident. A drunk driver hit the car he was driving with his family, killed his mother, his wife, and his daughter, all in one accident. 3 generations. And Jerry told me, we were together on Tuesday, and he says, I often wished for a reversal. And I knew immediately what he meant. He says, I wished that I could go back in time, that we could have stayed at the rest area 5 seconds longer, just 5 seconds. Just enough so we wouldn't have been right there on that corner when that drunk driver came around. Or maybe if we would have pulled off here to get treats for the kids, and we wouldn't have, anything, if I could just reverse it, have my wife and mother and daughter back. And Jerry said that he was sharing this with a friend who challenged him once and said, Jerry, let's suppose that you could do that. Let's suppose that somehow you could reverse this whole thing and get your family back. Let me ask you this, then what if Linda, your wife, got cancer 5 years later? Would you reverse that too? And of course, what'd Jerry say? Yeah. And what if a couple years after that, one of your kids went astray? Would you reverse that too? And the answer is, yeah. How many of you saw the Adam Sandler movie, Click? Isn't that what that was about? He got a remote control, and the operative word here is control. It gave him the control to just fast forward through all the unpleasant parts of his life, just skip over them. And the reason God doesn't give us control is because we would choose to skip anything that didn't satisfy our own selfish view of how life ought to look, right? And so God in his infinite wisdom doesn't give you that control. Jerry said this then. He said, Joe, he doesn't give us a remote that lets us do reversals. He gives us something better. You know what he gives us? Resurrection. He gives us resurrection. I learned something very profound over the last year. I learned that I couldn't think my way out of this, that I would have to trust my way out. And when I just started trusting God, it took me a while to get back into the rhythm of my daily time with God after Jeff died. But when I did, I found I had a new hunger for God and his word. And it was in one of those times with God, it was on January 12th of this year, that the Lord spoke to me, and this is my final thing I want to share with you. Luke 12, 6 and 7, Jesus said, what's the price of 5 sparrows? 2 copper coins? Yet God does not forget a single one of them. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. And in Matthew 10:29, Jesus said, aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And here's what I wrote. Jesus chose something common, inexpensive, a sparrow, to illustrate God's care for us. We take no notice when a sparrow dies, but God does. Not one is forgotten, he said. Not one dies apart from our Father. Not one is overlooked or unnoticed. God knows. God even knows the number of hairs on our head. He knows the tiniest details about you and me. He knows every thought, every deed, every motive, every fear, every sorrow, every tear, every joy. He knows everything. Not one of you is forgotten. So don't be afraid. You're more valuable to God than sparrows. As I reflected on this, I thought about Jeff. He was not forgotten by God. God knew my son's every thought and every deed. God knew when Jeff bought that drug, and God knew when he took it. And God knew that he would die and was there to meet him. Jeff didn't die because God forgot him, even for a moment. He was not forgotten, for not even a single sparrow falls to the ground apart from our Father. I wrote all this down, and then I had one of those wonderful moments when I felt like God spoke to me. And I wrote down what he said. Here's what it is. The Lord said to me, you and Lena were good parents to Jeff. Now it's my turn. Now it's my turn. And that image is so comforting to me. A father who knows all that I didn't know, was waiting to love my son and father him when I could no longer. A father who didn't forget him, a father who knew everything about him, a father who valued him far more than I ever could. And my son has gone to be with this father, this perfect, loving, all-knowing father. You have to trust your way out. You can't think your way out. And just a few days ago, just earlier this week, in my little morning time with God, I was praying, and I don't know why, but I just thought about when it's my turn. You know, when it's my turn to die and go meet God. I just had this image. And again, this is just my imagination, so I just had this image of, Jesus being there to meet me, and as I walk up, Jeff sticks his head out from behind Jesus. But here's what got me. When Jeff stuck out his head and looked at me, his face was beaming with joy, just alive with joy. And as soon as he saw me, he ran out and threw his arms around me and hugged me and said, "It's so good to see you, Dad." And I started bawling because that was something he was never able to do here on earth. He was never able to have that radiance in his face or that excitement to see you and give you a hug. And somehow, I just know when I see him, that's going to happen. I'm sure. Because I'm a Christian. And I believe in God. And it's the trust that pulls you through.